He had just turned 7 years old. A top math professor from MIT gave him a super difficult problem that no one solved. The girl stood in front of the blackboard for a whole half hour, but she couldn't come up with the right answer. The professor looked helpless. It seemed the girl was not as great as her grandmother had said. The grandmother could only take the girl and leave while complaining about the professor's deliberate difficulty. But unexpectedly, the girl suddenly said,
"It went downhill from there. Problem was unsolvable. Maybe the school isn't as great as you think it is."
The professor's problem was wrong from the beginning. A top math professor was using such a method to challenge a 7-year-old. Returning to the classroom, the girl not only corrected the mistake on the problem, but also quickly wrote down the correct answer. The professor was completely astonished and stood there frozen. You should know that this problem had stumped him for half a century. But what he was more curious about was why the girl did not point out initially that it was a wrong problem.
Frank says I'm not supposed to correct older people. Nobody likes a smartass.
The professor could never have imagined that this time she would end up shooting herself in the foot. He would never have thought that the girl's remarkable abilities were closely linked to her extraordinary origins, and this stunning performance of hers would completely change her destiny. The girl is named Annie, who grew up with her uncle from a young age. Knowing Annie's special background, her uncle wanted her to have the life of a normal child, so he sent her to a regular school in town. But unexpectedly, on her first day of school, there was a problem. The teacher just asked the children a simple math question and immediately faced a challenge from Annie.
3 plus 3? Really? What kind of school is this anyway? Everyone knows this.
Facing Annie's challenge, the teacher became a bit angry and directly ordered Annie to stand out of the lesson. Then he asked her several harder questions, but Annie was able to answer them instantly. The teacher was a bit surprised, but to maintain her own authority, she directly posed a question that even she could not verify.
57 multiplied by 135 is?
Annie sighed, obviously a bit stunned by the question. Seeing this, the teacher did not pursue further and turned around to continue with the lesson. But unexpectedly, just as she turned around, Annie immediately gave the answer.
7,695.
Realizing the truth, the teacher incredulously took out a calculator and quickly pressed a few buttons. The answer was indeed correct, and even Annie's calculations of the square root were completely accurate. This completely shocked the teacher, who immediately called the principal to observe the class. But unexpectedly, Annie asked on the spot,
"Mrs. Davis is our principal." Okay.
Okay, now I want you to get on your phone and call Frank and tell him to get me out of here.
Soon, Annie's uncle Frank was called to the school by the principal. The principal wanted to send Annie to a special school for prodigies and even offered a full scholarship to assist her. But Frank didn't think twice and immediately refused. The school was incredibly surprised. This was an opportunity ordinary families wouldn't even dare to dream of. However, after investigating Annie's background, they were shocked to discover that Annie's mother was a Nobel-level top math genius. The internet was full of her various awards and honors. Yet, for reasons unknown, she had taken her own life 7 years ago. And the uncle raising Annie was no ordinary man either. He was once a philosophy professor at Manhattan University, but now maintained his livelihood by fixing boats at the dock. Even though life was a bit tough, Annie's mathematical talent never faded. Moreover, her uncle, because of today's events, taught Annie not to boast about knowing more than others, and certainly not to confront teachers. And so the next day at school, Annie was much more reserved. She introduced herself like the other students, and even introduced her family's one-eyed panda. The teacher was very relieved to see this change, but unexpectedly, in the afternoon on the way to school on the bus, Annie caused trouble again. A young boy, carefully boarding the bus with his handmade homework, was deliberately tripped by an older student, ruining his hard-earned assignment, and was then mocked and humiliated by the older students. Unable to stand this, Annie immediately stood up, but the older student, far from repenting, even provocatively taunted her. How could Annie tolerate this? She directly picked up a book and threw it at him. This conflict caught the school's serious attention. The teacher asked Annie to admit her mistake in front of all her classmates. Annie complied, but her subsequent words left even the teacher in admiration.
They ruined it. Justin Zoo was the best art project. By far. It was awesome. Come on.
Everyone thought Annie needed to argue for herself, but she not only did not do so, instead she used simple praise to send warmth to the boy who lost his homework. A smart, just, emotionally intelligent girl with a bit of logic made the teacher even more curious. What kind of experiences could make a 7-year-old girl far surpass her years? She again approached Annie's uncle Frank, hoping to understand more about Annie's situation. It turned out Frank's sister Diane, due to their mother's excessive stress, dedicated her life solely to her studies and math problems. But after she became pregnant, her mother abandoned her as this was not part of her mother's plan, and Annie's father was a complete scoundrel, perhaps not even aware of Annie's existence. Thus, Uncle Frank had to take up the responsibility of raising Annie, spending simple yet beautiful 7 years together. Though Frank was aware of Annie's exceptional talent and her interest in math, he didn't want her childhood to be solely about studying. So whenever Annie took out those advanced mathematics textbooks, Frank would always forcibly take her out to play. In the sunset's afterglow, the two would chat idly, enjoying the tranquility and joy of life. But this idyllic life was not to last long, soon disrupted by a woman, Frank's mother and Annie's grandmother, once a top mathematician herself, who had given up academic research after getting married and having children, placing all her hopes on her daughter, driving her to desperation. Since then, Frank had cut off relations with her, and in 7 years, she hadn't visited once. She only came this time after learning Annie was a math prodigy, hoping to project her expectations once again onto her granddaughter. To win Annie's favor, the grandmother started with sweet gestures, bringing many gifts and even a brand new laptop. She was determined to win custody of Annie, but Frank, as her biological son, had long lost patience with his mother and flatly refused. The grandmother, very assertive, showed no remorse for her daughter's death, even considering her suicide a week after. In the end, they parted ways unhappily, but the grandmother did not give up and soon took the matter to court. At the first hearing, the grandmother's lawyer began to aggressively attack, falsely accusing Frank of abducting Annie and claiming she had sufficient evidence that Frank's current financial condition could not provide Annie a healthy life. Thus, she requested the judge to award custody to the grandmother. Against the opposing lawyer's accusations, Frank's lawyer, unfazed, effortlessly diffused the crisis with just a